Okay, so I'm Julie McDonald, and I'm here doing my interview with a general education teacher with regards to dealing with learners that are on the autism spectrum in the general classroom. So thanks for doing this, and would you mind just telling your name and maybe just a little bit about where you work and...
Sure. Penny Straub, and I've been a teacher for about 12 years. I've taught predominantly in private school, private Catholic school. In general classroom setting, I teach 7th and 8th grade, but my homeroom is 8th grade, but we switch for certain courses. So, for instance, they might go to the 7th grade teacher for math and science, and I might do English and social studies, or so. I don't have the kids 100% of the time, but 7th and 8th primarily.
Okay. And so I'm sure in, a Catholic school, private school setting, there's not probably as many students that have some of the same special education needs, but I would assume you've had some that are on the autism spectrum because it's so common. So first of all, have you had students on the autism spectrum?
I have had a few. I would say we probably don't see as many as public schools because we're smaller, and just the sheer difference in numbers. But I definitely have seen a few and have really learned a lot from the kids that I've seen, that I've taught.
Okay. So with learners on the autism spectrum, there's obviously going to come challenges and things that are just different than dealing with neurotypical students in the general classroom. So can you talk a little bit about the things that you've found to be challenging with, integrating these students into a general classroom?
I would say probably one of the biggest challenges is figuring out a pace and figuring out a balance between the child on the spectrum and the neurotypical children in the class, because there are going to be differences in the way that they learn, and so you have to be adaptable, and you have to figure out how to balance what the rest of the class needs while also making sure that the child on the spectrum is getting everything that they need and deserve as well. So you don't want to slight one for the other. You want to try to figure out a balance, and that's probably the trickiest part, but it can be done.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Anything else that you find challenging when you're...
Yeah, like maybe on a smaller scale, like speaking, certain individual kids, because every kid on the spectrum is going to be different. Things like, from my experience, kids on the spectrum a lot of times will be more literal. So I kind of had to remember that, so that when I'm giving instructions, I understand that they're going to read those instructions literally. So we don't realize how much of a difference that can make, because that's not how most of us, read it. If I want them to, remember what I've taught them for a test, let's say they read it on a study guide or in the book. If I deviate from the wording that they're used to, their brain's telling them, wait, that's different, that's not what I learned. And so sometimes something as simple as just the way that something is worded, making sure that it's consistent can help them.
So do you introduce a couple of ways that you say it to make sure that they're familiar with a couple of different ways the question might be phrased? Right. Or do you just make sure you stick to the one way?
It kind of depends on the subject. So if it's more of a vague subject or a topic that has more nuance, then we're going to have a lot more discussions about it. And we're going to use we might use other forms of media. We might use slideshows. We might even have movies that we show along with something, depending on the subject, so that as many ways that we can try to get it to, them to absorb it, we can, because again, just like neurotypical kids, every child on the spectrum is different. So you just sort of have to be adaptable and kind of learn what works for the kid that you're dealing with at the time. But having all of those tools and knowing that they can be useful, you just have to figure out which ones apply to that specific child.
Got it.
And another thing too that has been very helpful is a lot of kids on the spectrum will have other comorbidities and things like some of them have a real issue with sensory, have a lot of sensory issues, whether it's to do with textures. I mean, I've had kids that could not dissect. They could watch, they could observe, they could take the test on it, but couldn't touch it. And even sometimes the smells were a lot and they had to take a break. Because another thing that I've seen a lot of and is pretty common, at least with the ones I've dealt with, are that kids on the spectrum typically, some of the effects that they have, they call it somatization. It's where the anxiety and the way that they're feeling manifests itself physically. So they could get sick, they could have a stomach ache or a bad headache, or I've seen a kid break out in hives before. And so
this is from like the anxiety or stress of...
Yeah, of all kinds of different things. For example, I had a kid a couple years ago, and 8th grade boy who was on the spectrum, and he had a lot of anxiety, mostly stemming from socializing, because he was kind of mature. He spoke kind of like an adult and didn't always relate to his peers. So sometimes that could be isolating for him, and it could cause anxiety. And especially, like you could tell that he could see there's a difference, but he couldn't help it, and he knew that he still wanted to fit in.
Yeah.
But it's
maybe
just
didn't know what to do
didn't know
about
how,
it. Yeah.
and didn't know what to do about it. So it made him feel nervous and always afraid to make a mistake. This kid would rather, if he didn't know what to do or didn't know the answer, he would just kind of freeze and wait until somebody helped him. So he'd rather do that than do the wrong thing.
Got it. Yeah.
And so I found that, for that specific child, I would only call on him if I was pretty sure that he could give me an answer. I didn't call on him on something brand new, because he would be listening and he'd be, following along. And I know he's absorbing it because, he can do his homework and everything. But if he doesn't raise his hand to answer a question, I try not to call him unless I know he can answer it, because that alone, just calling on him, all of a sudden now he's not listening anymore. And all he's thinking, instead of trying to hear what I'm saying, is, what if she calls on me again? What am I going to... And he starts to feel sick and he starts to panic. And then he gets even more nervous because the thought of raising his hand and everyone looking at him and drawing that attention just really gave him so much anxiety. So, there's things like that, that one kid's comorbidities or, one kid, a lot of kids have on the spectrum might have ADHD or dysgraphia. And with the dysgraphia, I've had kids that I couldn't read their writing to grade their homework. And if I asked them, they couldn't read it.
Yeah.
So, it's like there's a bit of a disconnect sometimes. They know what's going on and they could sit and explain to you the 3/5 Amendment in detail, or they could explain to you just in their head solving a problem and explain it to you verbally. And so sometimes adapting the way that you test them, or the way that they take notes, or the way that they complete their assignments, because sometimes writing is the very worst thing they can do. But they could type the assignment, type the answer, or if it's like a long answer, an essay answer to a question, then you let them tell you verbally. You let them explain it to you, and you know whether or not they've grasped it or not. Now, it's a little more tricky with things like math, because there's steps and you want to make sure. But these are all things that, you just have to try to adapt a little bit at a time. There's a lot of small
and I'm sure
things.
time is an issue too with being able to do some of those things.
It
so
is. Because there's often they need, number one, with the sensory issues, noise, things that are background noise to everyone else that we just sort of tune out, can be a huge distraction. They might hear someone walking down the hall, and that completely takes them away from what they're doing. Or the air conditioner kicks on, or a fan, or somebody coughs. All those things to them are much more distracting generally than they would be to, neurotypical kids. And it's something that I think having some space, having a place, being a smaller school, you kind of need to use all the space you have for the students that you have. And so there's just not a lot of extra room. If we had a little more room where we could have a place for them to go that was like a place they could go to calm down
Right.
or to concentrate to take a test if they needed to. And generally sometimes it's pretty common that they'll need a little extra time for tests
Sure.
or some kind of accommodation. So having a place to go to do that's without distraction and without other people, even just other people watching you or being around, can make
Right.
all the difference.
Yeah, that's one I was going to get to, and seeing things that you could maybe would be helpful to have. So with these challenges, then I'm sure you've come up with some plans, ways to deal with some of these things and some accommodations that you've used. So, what are some things that you have found to be helpful with these kids to help them kind of level the playing field a little bit or integrate into the classroom?
So I would say the very first thing that's super important is to right away open communication and develop a relationship with the parents and get to know the nuances of that kid, because they're not going to all be the same. They don't always present the same way, and they don't always learn the same way. So you want to kind of know as much as you can what their strengths are, their weaknesses, the things that are going to be challenging, and the things that they may have to overcome, and also the things that they excel at. Because if you can you can take the things that they're good at and their gifts and use those, and use them to help them learn. Or like I had a boy that he was fairly recently diagnosed, like maybe a year before, and kind of was nervous about everyone knowing, but also I think it was causing him a lot of stress because he wanted them to know, like I think he felt that he was different, but he couldn't explain why, and knowing was like a relief to him. So he kind of wanted everyone else to know, like, listen, if you don't understand why I do this, it's not that I'm trying to be difficult or I'm doing it on purpose, So, but he was nervous about doing that. So we talked, and they were going to be doing like an oral report. And in the past, there had been times where that caused him terrible anxiety.
Like standing up in front
of the class by himself and having to talk. I mean, it would just terrify him. So there were times where I would let him record his and present to the class, because
like on a video.
So they could watch on the monitor, and that way there were even times where I would send that to the kids' Chromebook, so it came to them in a link, and they could watch it on their own, and then they could comment, and then give their feedback.
So it took some of the social pressure off, but he's still fulfilling the parts of the assignment that you wanted to get done.
And so little things like they were doing a presentation, and this specific time, like I said, he was kind of navigating, finding out himself not super long ago, and also how it was going to affect his peers. And I think his hope was it was going to help if they knew. So I asked him if he would like that to be the topic of his presentation. It'd be a little different than everyone else's, but he was thrilled. He was excited, and he dove right in. He did ask if it would be okay if his mom was there, and I said absolutely. And the principal came down, and it was every kid in the class was just leaning forward like this. They all raised their hands and asked questions. They were very respectful, and they had great questions. And things like when I say using their gifts and their interests and things like that, I mean, this is just a minor example, but one of the ways that we kind of talked about the differences in the way that his brain worked and the way that neurotypical kids think, or that their brain processes things, that they can take completely different routes and still get to the same place. So it's not wrong, it's just different. So this kid was really into video games. So I would tell him, just because, if you're a PlayStation and all these kids are Xboxes, and you can't play an Xbox game because you're a PlayStation, but they can't play a PlayStation game because they're an Xbox, and neither of you are wrong. You're just different. Yeah. And so, but both are great. They're both they're
it's
great
just
things
on a
about
different format.
Just
even
a
if
different
it's the
format.
Same
exactly.
Thing. Right.
And so, being able to kind of try to level with them in a way that they can relate to.
Yeah.
That helps. And like I said, just aside from communicating with the parents, because I've even had where if a kid really really had a hard time, one kid that I had a sibling, an older sibling in the school. So sometimes if he was really having a hard time, or if he was having like a lot of anxiety, his sister might, come down and just talk to him, because she kind of knew,
Sure,
the routine. Or keeping, like some crackers in the office if his stomach started to hurt, things like that. So opening communication, trying to find out, like, his strengths and his challenges, and then being very adaptable and being able to, and creative, and trying to, like the same boy, with all the anxiety of the attention on him for any reason. Like I said, he would start to feel bad, but the thought of raising his hand and having to explain, I need to go to the bathroom, or my stomach hurts, or can I go to the office? In his mind, everyone was looking at him, and it just gave him horrible anxiety. So we figured out that, and the anxiety would just keep getting worse, because the longer he sat there worrying about it, it's still hurting, and he's sitting there suffering, but he doesn't want to raise his hand. So something as simple as we made a couple cards. They were different, like red and yellow or red and green. One said sick and one said anxiety. And I laminated them, and he kept those in his desk. And if he needed to, let's say like he had a stomach ache or he wasn't feeling good and he needed to go to the office, he could just put the sick card on my desk. And we established a plan ahead of time, so that if you put this on my desk, I won't ask you where you're going, but we both have to know. So we made a plan. If you put this card, then I know that you're going to the office. And if you put this card, then there was sort of a, like a breezeway at the end of the hall that was just, you walk through some doors and it was where the stairs were, but it was just sort of a little open area. And we had an extra desk that we put down there because it was quiet.
Okay.
It wasn't bright. And if he needed to do some work, make up some work, or finish a test, or just something where he needed to concentrate, or he was having anxiety about something, but he didn't need to go home, but I didn't want it to get to that point. Sometimes just letting him sit there and sort of take some breaths and calm down, and know that if he started to feel bad, or if he started to get nervous or upset, he's not trapped. Just knowing that sometimes, or knowing that he had those cards, sometimes he didn't even need to use them because it didn't get that bad, So things like that, small things like that, can make a huge difference. It definitely added to, or lended itself to him making it through the day. More often. Yeah,
because I'm sure even with general learners that have school anxiety or any kind of anxiety, that can put a big damper in their day.
Definitely. Just being adaptable and trying to keep things as structured as possible for the kid, but being adaptable yourself.
Right.
For the kid.
And when you talk about structure, like how would you deal with things like schedules and unexpected things that might come up in the day? Because I know transitions can be hard.
That definitely was something that would cause issues with more than one of the kids that I've seen. And so typically I would keep our daily schedule on the board, and it would have the times and what class, and they learned quickly enough, this means I'm going across the hall or whatever, but they knew what to expect in what order. Now, if that day, let's say we're going to have an assembly, I tried as best I could to let them know a day ahead, or even sometimes sooner if it's a field trip or something that's even, going to be a bigger deal. Because I found that generally, in my experience, knowing, even if it's something that they're not looking forward to, or something that even worries them, having the time to process it and knowing what's coming can change everything. Because they're able to prepare themselves.
Yeah, they've gone through it in their mind, and they're like, okay, this is what's going to happen.
Yes.
And they've had time to think about it and maybe ask questions if they're not sure what's going to happen.
And if we had an assembly, or if we have, if we know we're going to have a fire drill, or if we know we're going to have, something that's just not on our normal schedule, if I can let them know ahead of time, that helps. If not, then I let them know as soon as I can, or as soon as it happens, and let them know, like, listen, this is why we're doing this, and explain what we're going to do. And then if they have issues, I can be there and sort of try to talk them through it, or, use some other soothing, techniques.
Some kind of a support that
some
they
kind of
can
support
use
and
to help
soothing
them get
technique,
through it,
whether it means, some I've had times where kids like that yeah, they if you do deep breathing, or sometimes if you for certain kids there might be they might have like an actual sort of routine that a parent does, and it might mean saying certain things or breathing a certain way. Like one mom I know would tell her son, because he'd get in a panic, and she'd say, okay, now I want you to smell the roses and blow out the candle. Because if you tell a kid in through your nose and out through your mouth, you get somebody who's like, sometimes they hyperventilate. So you kind of have to show them, and that's a way he could understand.
Got it. That
So,
makes sense.
No, like I said, knowing the kids, and if the parents, because the parents, I promise you, if there's they probably have a lot of this, techniques that they use at home that they've had to figure out through trial and error, and so they might already know what works, and if it's not broke, and they know their kid better than anybody. So it's always good to find those things out too.
Right. Parents are the experts on their own kids, so they are a big help. Especially if did you have like you didn't have a resource personnel on staff that was
no, and so in a public school, they have them on staff, and they have usually their own classrooms, maybe not for a full-time class, but for kids to come and get services. And if something comes up and they need it, it's there on their grounds, and they have it at their facility.
Right.
And if we need, for example, if we have a child who, needs an evaluation for whatever kind of plan, the district will provide that, and they will provide it, at their cost, because if the kid, even if they're in private school, they still can access those services from the district. But the problem becomes they have to travel to you. So scheduling and just the fact that they're somewhere else and they have to come to you can cause, it's just not as available. So having that more available would, I'm sure, make a huge difference for the kids, because they're just getting more of what they need.
right. It's one of those catch-22s where you maybe have a little more ability to do things in your own way, or in a more personal. You may have smaller class sizes, but then you may not have the resources available that you have in a bigger district.
So we, as a private school, we don't, generally we don't need to do, a really rigid service plan, but because we're small, and because our class sizes aren't as big as public schools, we don't have as many students, so they get more personal attention anyway. And we can, so basically if it's a reasonable expectation and something that we can do, we try to do it, because, if it's not going to be at the detriment of all the other kids, or if it's within our abilities.
Right.
And otherwise we can call in the district, but having someone there, having our own, resource staff would be
Sure.
definitely,
like in an ideal world, that would be
in an ideal
something
world, that would be hugely beneficial for the kids, because they're there when you need them, and you don't have to schedule, because what they need today might not be what they need next week.
Okay,
And there could be a new problem or something else they're dealing with, or it could have gotten worse. So just the access would
and it's
be
just to be able to maybe even as a teacher, like pop in and say, hey, I'm dealing with this issue. Have you seen this before?
Yes. And I know at a lot of public schools, because I have, friends that work at public schools, and a lot of them have their resource teachers have, the teacher will, like, I would recommend, okay, I think that he could benefit from this. Like, executive functioning is always a huge challenge for kids on the spectrum. And so, and writing things down, like we talked about in a planner or something, isn't generally helpful for them. May not help. In my experience, I've found that typically, not always, because like I said, no two are just the same. And so they all have their own special circumstances. But, for the ones
that doesn't work.
If a planner doesn't work, maybe we download a free, in fact, we did this for a girl that I had, and she didn't like to write stuff down, or she'd forget, or she'd look and get distracted, and then she'd skip a line writing down what was on the board, or whatever. So we do have a tech person that works at our school, and he's there 3 or 4 days a week usually. And so we had him come, and he had to install a planner type app on her computer, because we had to we had to make special he had to unlock it and install it, but it was like, well, that's something easy that's within our ability to do. It doesn't cost anything extra, and
Yeah.
she's doing it a little different, but as long as she's keeping track of
Sure,
things,
and then she
can
could
set
have
up
notifications.
and they can even go, if her Chromebook's at home and it's shut and she doesn't even realize that she's got homework because she hasn't opened it and looked, which is another problem.
Yeah.
She could set alerts to her phone. We could set alerts to her mom and dad's phone where
Oh, yeah.
it says, homework, and it just every day she can set an alert that sends her the assignments or sends her parents the assignments depending on the age and how well she's doing with that kind of stuff. So little things.
Technology
when you can use it, or kids sometimes. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that technology can help. It's just when it's a kid that has like the type of problems that I discussed, those kind of things can make learning easier, make testing easier. Their notes are legible, so it makes studying easier. What else? Let me think. Oh yeah, I know the boy that I was talking about earlier. He did not he was the one that had a lot of anxiety. He just didn't like attention drawn to himself, and there were several times that I said, well, Jess, you can come and discuss this with me if you're having a problem, or you can I will try to help in any way I can. But I knew that he didn't like the attention of having to come up and say something, and just the pressure just made him nervous. So I said, but if you don't feel comfortable talking to me, face to face, or you don't want other people to see you talking to me and draw attention, just email me. You can email me. You can even email me if you heard a funny joke or you just have something that you wanted to tell me.
Okay.
And that way he knows that he's not going to bother me. He's not bothering me if he has to ask me 10 questions a day. I told him, email me as often as you like. He was very, he was a very, very smart kid. His language and capacity for not just his vocabulary, but his capacity to understand, language and just he was gifted in a lot of ways. And then there were other things where he was a little behind or struggled with. But that was something that made him comfortable to come to me, and he did. And it wasn't like he overused it, but anytime he did have a problem, it helped him self-advocate, which is another thing that, especially when they're getting to be in the grades that I teach, that's when they need to really start learning to try to do these things for themselves, but it's a process, and they have to.
So
just
that's like a
any
stepping stone.
Yes.
And from there, as he got more comfortable,
yes.
Did he then ever start to more verbally?
Yeah, it was funny because before Christmas break, and like I said, I kept in touch with the parents, and that really helps too. But before Christmas break, this kid was raising his own hand, or actually participating without being prompted to, and which was great. And I didn't draw a lot of attention to it. Thanked him, and and another thing too. Is praise is I just in general for me that's my preferred I prefer praise over punishment, but for kids that are already a little self-conscious or feel different, even small victories need to be acknowledged and praised, because they might seem small to us, but for them they can be huge. So acknowledging those things and giving them credit when they do those things, and when they step out of their comfort zone or they do something brave, you want to always let them know you noticed it, and you don't have to make a big deal, but just make sure that it's acknowledged.
Sure, because they might not want that attention
exactly.
either. But to know that
it's been noticed, and that someone appreciates the work they put in and how hard they're trying.
Yeah, because they still have the same needs as everybody else, even if they can't communicate them as well.
And again, the same boy, people pleaser, rule follower, very strong sense of right and wrong. So he's not the type of kid that's going to take advantage of those things. He didn't. And it gave him the freedom and the comfort to, step out of his comfort zone a little bit more without feeling like,
like
terrified.
Small steps.
Yeah. So yeah, that kind of stuff definitely helps too.
Cool. So are there any other things that you would say in just a general, in a perfect world I would have this, or here's what I would like to see for my students with autism spectrum disorder?
Well, yeah, in a perfect world, I'd have a long list. But knowing the limitations of being in a private school, and it comes with its benefits too, but obviously technology is expensive, but it's super necessary, and especially in certain situations for these kids, it can make all the difference. So maybe newer technology, things that they could access that way. Obviously, like we talked about before, support staff or resources, access to resources in, more in real time. And I think a resource personnel person who could sort of oversee, someone who can kind of guide teachers in how to implement, because they know it's their job to know all the ins and outs. And sometimes, again, with each kid being different, and each plan's going to be a little different. So
and it's not your specific,
right. It may not be your
you're not a
specialty.
special ed teacher,
You're not trained for that.
right.
So they are somebody who knows how to do this, and they've done it over and over, and they've done it lots of different ways, and they can tell you things to avoid, the pitfalls, and also tricks and tips that can make things easier. But overall, most importantly, make sure that the plans that the teacher is able to implement the plans, and that the student is, benefiting from them. And kind of keeping an eye on just overseeing, so that if something does need to be adapted, that is their specialty, and they might be able to say, okay, well, this isn't working how we thought it would, so we're going to try this. And so just having that knowledge and someone who could,
sure,
oversee the
suggest
whole
things
program.
maybe you wouldn't have even thought of. I'm sure.
Yeah, and then also as much professional development as you can get, because the things that we know now about the spectrum, we know so much more than we did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and we're learning more and more and more every day. And so as up to date as we can keep on, the new things that we learn, the new, methods, or the new techniques, or anything that we can learn, the more we can learn to help them, and the more that we can learn,
More tools in our
tools in our
right.
toolbox, the better. So always
Yeah.
as much of that as we can get.
Well, yeah, and I didn't even know the thing about somatization and some of the physical. I hadn't really thought of that. So that's something that
Like
I'm
I
sure
said,
as they learn more and there's more research compiled.
and like I said, I saw a kid that literally broke out in hives once, and watching them, from the beginning, and being able to, watch their progress, and just see it, see their confidence grow, and see what works. Makes it super rewarding, because, you actually sort of watch this kid come out of their shell and grow right in front of you. And so you kind of get an idea of what's working. And again, adaptability.
Yeah.
If it's not working.
And do you think it's pretty beneficial for them to be in a general classroom as much as possible?
I do. I think, now there's exceptions to that. I think it depends on the severity, and it depends on their things like their medical needs. It depends on, it depends on the specific
Sure.
child. But I think in general, if they can be, for the most part, it's more beneficial, because I think, again, their learning skills and abilities are going to vary, but the social part of it is almost always a little difficult. And so if you can help kind of encourage and nurture that part, help them to sort of assimilate as much as possible to how things are going to be next
Yeah.
year, the year after, when they graduate,
Because they're living in a neurotypical world
Exactly.
primarily, and they need to
Yes.
navigate that.
And it's kind of like, there's left-handed people and right-handed people, but the world's kind of set up for right-handed people. Most things are, light switches and doorknobs, and all kinds of things are, if you write down on a piece of paper,
Right.
left-handed people the kids always complain about their, can I wash my hands? Because they have to go across. So things like that maybe we don't notice, but might be a real nuisance to them. But just because you're left-handed doesn't mean that's wrong. It just means that because most people are right-handed, you're going to have to kind of adapt the way you do things,
Right.
to make it work for you. And there's all kinds of ways to do that. The sky's the limit. It's just what works for an individual, and is it something feasible?
Okay. Well, that's really helpful. I think I picked up a lot of tips and things, so I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you so much for doing this.
You're very welcome.